I think we're actually in a pre-revolutionary situation, but it's the first global revolution. We've had revolutions in France, you had in America, in Russia, where the peasants revolted and the aristocracy lost. Today, we are the aristocracy. We are the 4% of the world who have the riches, who have the guns, who are controlling the world. The other 95% are the peasants, and they're getting pretty fed up with things.
Hello, I'm Hazel Henderson, and this is Worth Quoting, the Open Campus series from Florida Community College at Jacksonville. And today our guest is Peter Russell, the English management consultant, and Peter's latest book is called The White Hole in Time, Our Future Evolution and the Meaning of Now. And I'm delighted to be talking with Pete because he's an old friend of mine, and we're going to be discussing the inner roots of today's planetary crises. So Pete, it's a delight to have you here.
It's lovely to be here.
And I think that what I'd like to start with really is this whole issue of whether these planetary crises that we're dealing with today, whether it's pollution or war or violence or desertification or holes in the ozone layer or the warming of the planet's atmosphere, I think we both agree that these are really crises of human perception. But I'd like you to talk about your particular spin on that.
Right. Well, I think if you look at anything that's going wrong, all the examples you've mentioned, they all come back ultimately to decisions that human beings have made. And the very fact we're allowing the crisis to continue is, again, a human decision. We have all the science, technology we need to actually solve the crisis we're up against. We have the money as well. What we don't seem to have is the willingness. We're stuck in a way of thinking that's not only created the crisis but prevented us from solving them. And basically the way I see it is human beings are very self-centered, greedy, very egocentric, and it's that's behind the crisis. We want everything for ourselves, we want to consume more ourselves, we want to be comfortable, and we're doing this to the detriment of our environment.
Yes, and you know, I think that the fact that there was a time in history, you point this out in your book, and I do too in my books, that this whole idea of making sure of our physical welfare and making sure we have enough food and shelter and all of that was very natural and very human, but we somehow got stuck in that rut, and we were thinking that we had to keep on consuming more and more. We didn't get the idea of where enough is.
Right. I think you're right. I mean, most of us today in the West have all the food we need. We have the comforts, the warmth, the clothing. We've got our physical needs met. I think the problem is we have a lot of psychological needs, the needs for security, for recognition, for approval, to feel we're in control of things. And those needs we try to meet in the same way through the physical world. And so if we want to be more secure, we think if we gather more possessions, more objects, we'll be more secure. If we consume the right things, people will approve of us. And that it works for a little bit, for 10 minutes or 10 weeks it works, but then once it wears off, we have to consume more. And I think that's the basic problem. We're trying to use the physical world to satisfy our deeper inner needs.
And at the same time, you know, we have these kind of ideologies of producing more and being more efficient and all of this, but we haven't been very good about sharing the fruits of this. And even in countries in the Northern Hemisphere, industrial countries, we haven't been very good at sharing the fruits of all of this technological prowess, and we still have poor people and still have homeless people, even in the United States and other very rich countries. So is this part of what you mean by this sort of moral crisis where we really need now to think in larger terms of the whole?
I think that's another reflection of the self-centeredness. We want more and more for ourselves because we're stuck in this belief that the only way we're really going to feel okay is if we have everything physically we could possibly need. And so that's why we want it for ourselves at other people's expense.
And unfortunately, the economic system kind of reinforces that. You know, you could almost say that our economic system runs on the 7 deadly sins. You know, selfishness, greediness, acquisitiveness, competitiveness. And it does shortchange the fact that human beings are just as cooperative. We really love giving and sharing, and yet the economic system doesn't really reward volunteerism. I mean, in economic theory, that's considered to be irrational, to give away your time. So that is not being reinforced.
And I think it's not just the economic system. I think the media does that as well. Television, I mean, a lot of the adverts, a lot of the material you see on commercial television is again reinforcing this same materialistic belief system that says in order for us to be happy we've got to consume, we become human havings and doings rather than human beings. Always about what can we have, what can we do.
Yes. I mean, I always think too, you know, that we have in the United States an economy which is built on consumption, what I like to call heroic feats of consumption. You know, I don't know whether you remember, but when I first came to the United States in 1959, there was a recession going on, and even President Eisenhower had little buttons that he was giving out saying, you auto buy now, and everything would be okay if every American went and got themselves even further in hock to buy another automobile. And, you know, we can't go on like that, can we?
Well, it's destroying the planet. I mean, it's interesting, we now consume about 350 times each person what we consumed at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And there's 10 times more in terms of numbers. So we're actually consuming 3,500 times what we consumed 200 years ago. Which means, if you actually work it out, in 1 year, we now consume what previously was consumed in the whole period from the rise of Greek culture through to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We consume the whole of human history each year.
And so
it's increasing.
That is incredible, isn't it? And so no wonder there's the toxic dumps everywhere and the pollution and the mines all mined out.
And the current economic system, I think you pointed out in your book, don't you? Your new book, Paradigms in Process. Progress. The whole economic system is based on this driving consumption. It has to change ultimately. I think the question is, does it change through collapse? Or can we actually create and foster a new way of managing the world?
I mean, I think both you and I, over the past 10 years or so, have been trying in our own ways to see if there's a soft landing somewhere through all of this. And one of the ways I've tried to do it is to point out that measuring the progress of a human society by using the gross national product is kind of gross, because that's all it is, you know, and it was invented in World War II to maximize war production. We never really looked at it again. And in a sense, what we're both trying to do from different directions is to question some of these basic assumptions. Now, what I have to do before we go any further is to ask you, what is the white hole in time?
Right. It's interesting. It's the opposite almost to a black hole in space. But the way a black hole in space forms, it's the end of a star's life, and a star grows faster and faster and faster until it's changing over, first of all, millions of years, then thousands of years, then years, and then minutes, until it collapses into this explosion of light called a supernova, leaving behind a black hole. And I see human evolution is on a similar accelerating track. And what I hypothesize in the book, that the end of our evolution is a similar explosion of light, but this time an explosion, an inner explosion of awakening, an explosion of consciousness. And we've been accelerating towards this for thousands of years. But now I think it's just around the corner, maybe in the next 50 years or so. If we can come through this crisis safely, then I think on the other side of that is an awakening which is probably beyond all our imagination. I think we're actually reaching a climax of our evolution, but it's an inner climax, not an outer climax.
And somehow there's nowhere else for us to go now but to grow up.
Exactly.
We can't grow fatter consuming. We can't grow taller. There isn't enough space. We can't grow in terms of population. And so we're going to have to just basically grow up, aren't we?
Well, I see human society at the moment is a bit like an adolescent. It's like an adolescent when it discovers its power and its muscles and it starts sort of shaping up a bit and throwing its weight around. And then you move on through life and you mature. Some people move out of adolescence at 25, others about 50, but we gradually realise that throwing our weight around is not the way to get the peace and quiet we want, that the material world isn't everything. But I think human society as a whole, or Western society particularly, is at the adolescent stage, and we need to move into a much more mature, we often say wise, we talk about old people as being wise. We need to develop that wisdom on a social level, and I think that's the most important thing we have to learn to do today.
And you have a lot in your new book on time, and time has always interested me, you know, because indigenous populations for years and years have had a sort of cyclical view of time. There were seasons and all of that. And then it wasn't really until in Western societies, Western industrial societies got going, that we began to have this idea of time as linear, and we were all on this straight line marching along to some kind of progress. And so how do you see that whole?
Well, I think if you go back several thousand years, then all people saw was cycles. They saw the cycle of day and night, the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of people being born and dying. All they saw was cycles. But as human progress slowly speeded up, there came a time when gradually you could begin to see progress through your own lifetime, that things were changing. And I think you're right, the Industrial Revolution accelerated that. You could see change now happening over 50 years or 25 years. And so this idea of linear progress crept in and then became more and more dominant. And that's what we see today, and we now see progress. We measure it in terms of decades or 5 years or even 2 years. We look at how things have changed, and that became the dominant measure of time, not the cycles, but how things had changed. So I think it's almost inevitable, as things have speeded up, that there has been this shift from the cyclical to the linear. And unfortunately, I think we're stuck in our society with this idea of efficiency. Almost any invention that catches on is something that makes life more efficient, quicker. And so we do everything we can to keep it speeding up more and more. We build more freeways so that you can save 2-minute travel time, whatever it is. We keep on speeding the process up.
I sometimes think of that, you know, in terms of the computer revolution, you know, and once everybody gets computers and can fire out hundreds of letters faster and faster, and then we get into faxes and all of that, in the end, it's not any more efficient for anybody because we're all doing the same thing, and it just means that we're all more and more like rats on a treadmill, and you're trying to save time, and nobody understands quite why. And that brings me to another subject I think that you and I both thought a lot about, and that is the time is money thing, and the whole sort of idolatry almost around money. Well,
I think it comes back to this basic belief system that we're hypnotized into, that what we have or do is going to determine how happy we are. And so that's why we like to maximize our time. We think the more we can get done, the better we're going to feel. And money works the same way. We think the more money we have, the more experiences we can buy, the more products we can buy, the more opportunities we can buy. We equate money with happiness. And I think our fundamental motivation is to feel happy, to move away from pain and suffering, to feel more comfortable and happy inside. In fact, I would say the ultimate measure of human society should be gross national happiness. That's what I call it.
That's pretty good.
I don't know how you measure gross national happiness, but that's what we ultimately want. But we equate, we think that money is the means to it. And that's why we love money so much.
Yes, and you know, just going back to the whole gross national product thing, of course, that's a totally money-based measure, and it equates progress, which how much money has been just changed hands in a year, and all of this. And in a sense, it would be easy to devise a sort of a public opinion survey that you might call national satisfaction, and simply ask people, you know, how satisfied you are with the total quality of your life, which can't all be reduced to money. And, you know, this is what I've been pushing on for a long time, you know, that if we had quality of life indicators, like they do, for example, here in the city of Jacksonville, it would give people an idea that, okay, even if my salary didn't go up this year, the air got cleaner, or the school system got
Yes.
better, or the health services in the city were
Right.
better. And people would begin to remember that we don't actually
Exactly.
can't turn everything into money.
And I think that would break the vicious cycle. I mean, at the moment, we think that feeling happy is to do with what we have out there. And we only focus on what we have out there. If you started measuring people's inner satisfaction, they would begin to break that connection and say, well, hang on, I'm actually more satisfied than I was last year, although maybe nothing's changed materially, but something's changed within me.
Well, you know, there was a study done recently here in the US, and they find that more and more people now are willing to accept salary cuts for more time. And so even there, you know, people are beginning to realize that time is, in a sense, more valuable
Yes.
than money.
Yeah.
So maybe that whole thing is shifting a little bit. Now, in your book, you talk about something which I find is very interesting, and that is that the way we have to shift so fast, really, because we've created this global crisis that's not going away, or maybe we have 30 years to turn things around if we're lucky. And you talk about needing an inner Manhattan Project, you know, instead of making an atomic bomb, how could we really get to dealing with re-education?
Yes, yes.
Talk about that.
Well, it comes from my belief that the fundamental problem in the world today is not so much what we're doing to the world, but the way we think, the values behind it. And I think this is the key thing that we need to put our attention on. I actually believe that inner growth needs to become actually a political issue. And the idea of the Manhattan Project, if we go back to the original Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb, it was the first time that a number of different universities, a number of different institutions had been brought together to work on the same task. And that's because it was seen to be such an important task. I believe that raising human consciousness, changing our values, is even more important today, because it's not just ending the war with Japan that's the issue, it's actually saving humanity that's the issue. And I think we need to have a concerted global research and development project happening all over the planet, finding the best ways to actually change human values, to raise human consciousness, to get us to actually explore what it is we really want and how to go about achieving that.
You know, something I proposed in my first book back in 1978 was the idea that there should be, in a big computer somewhere, stored all of the basic elements of all of the world's value systems, what I call cultural DNA. You know, every society comes up with its particular cultural DNA pattern, and that they should be examined for which ones had been most life-affirming and survival-oriented and tested over the longest time to fit that population with the limits of its ecosystem and all of that, so that we would have a grab bag to choose from, and we'd be able to start weeding out which values really are life-affirming and which values can move us toward protecting all life on Earth, including our own, because if we don't protect other life species, we're not going to be able to save ourselves.
Right.
And so, you know, in a sense, I just made a kind of leap in that book and said I thought that they were love, sharing, cooperation, and honesty. I mean, that was just a wild shot at it. I don't know what you think would come out of such an exercise of trying to clarify what values are life-affirming.
I don't know, I haven't actually thought about that. It's more for me is thinking, what is it we really want out of life? I think that's the question I'm trying to ask people, is going to see, to realise what we really want is something inner, and then what are the values that take us towards that. And I think love, honesty, I would say also being oneself and the ability to relax. Also, maybe the ability to relax is not a value, but integrity, being oneself, is part of that.
Yes, oh, it certainly is. And particularly, I think, in the sort of business rat race where everybody is sort of trying to maximize their income, you get this sense that many corporate executives sort of feel they have to put a mask on in the morning, and they use such phrases as, well, I have to get suited up to play, you know, out there in the competitive marketplace. And they may be wonderful cooperative family people at home, but they feel they have to kind of put on this schizophrenic thing that when they go out there in the competitive world, they have to be, you know, something that's not really real.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I find a lot of people I meet in business, that's the big issue they're facing is how do they actually marry their personal values, what they actually feel as human beings, with the needs of the corporation. And a lot of the work I'm doing is actually trying to help people put their values into practice, because it's the economic values that I think are destroying the world at the moment. Because it clearly doesn't work. I mean, the way it's leading to the decimation of the rainforest.
Yes, and this, I think that there's a real reconsidering in this country, you know, of profit maximizing and the bottom line as being the only values. You know, and studies have been done that show that even entrepreneurs don't altogether start a company just to make money. They do it because they want autonomy and they want to be able to release their creativity. And you've written a lot about creativity in this new book.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things we really need to develop at the moment. I mean, it's interesting you're talking about people being rewarded by money and wanting time. There's a company I was working with in the Netherlands recently where it was a computer company, and they found a lot of their top people were leaving and going to other competitors and weren't being paid any more money whatsoever. And when they looked at why they were leaving, it was because in the first company they were working in large teams on projects, and in the other company where they're going to, they were working in very small teams, and they had much more opportunity to be creative and exercise their creativity. And that's what they needed, was an expression for their creativity. They didn't want money, they had enough money. I think most of us actually have enough money. We don't think we do, because this is the hypnotic state where our society keeps on wanting to tell us we don't have enough money, and if only we had more we'd be happier. But the waking up is people realizing, hang on, I do have enough.
And, you know, in a sense, the whole problem of us not learning to distribute the fruits of all of this technological advantages that we have, what happens is that for people who genuinely don't have enough, for poor people or people who've been disadvantaged, our mass media tend, because they're selling us products all the time, tend to focus all of their programs on people who already do have enough. And, you know, so that it's kind of not needs anymore, it's all of this sort of deep psychological stuff, you know, you're not okay unless you buy an infinity car or a Mercedes or something like that. And we tend to completely obliterate the people who have been left out in one way or another of this kind of gravy train, which really, you know, when you think of what's happening now in the world, where we have the North and the South, and the problems of the Northern Hemisphere are we're on the whole consuming too much, while people in the South, 3/4 of humanity, literally are starving.
Yeah. And people in the North don't want to hear about it. We don't see that much on television, and when people do, they say, oh, I can't bear any more bad stories or horror stories. And yet I think what we have to do is face up to the inequalities that we are creating. I mean, just by the way, terms of trade, whereby the North trades with the South, we're continually exploiting them, and that's going to come back on us.
Yes, or if we look at the whole banking system internationally, where all of those countries got into debt when our banks were trying to recycle those petrodollars and find some place to lend them out, and they got sort of swept along in this siren song, oh, you should borrow money because then you can industrialize and become rich like we are, and they all got on the gravy train. And of course we've got this mountain of unrepayable debt, so they have to cut down rainforests now to pay the debt.
Well, I think, I mean, the way I see it, I think we're actually in a pre-revolutionary situation, but it's the first global revolution. We've had revolutions in France, you had in America, in Russia, where the peasants revolted and the aristocracy lost. Today, we are the aristocracy. We are the 4% of the world who have the riches, who have the guns, who are controlling the world. The other 95% are the peasants, and they're getting pretty fed up with things.
And we control the images.
Yeah.
And you know, it's I'm sure you've experienced this if you've been in countries in the Southern Hemisphere, and they are constantly dominated by American television. They see Dallas.
I know. What do they make of Dallas? I mean, no wonder they start wanting to join the party. And how they can't. How can we tell them, no, you can't join the party? And that's the challenge for us, is we have to improve the quality of the life of the South without encouraging them to go on this mad consumption route that we've been on. We've got to lower our consumption and at the same time raise their quality of life.
And you know, that discussion is getting on the table finally in the US. And in a sense, I mean, you can get people now talking about the idea that we don't really need to use more energy. I mean, I always like to remind people that we used half as much energy per capita in the 1960s in the US. Now, we were hardly living in caves, were we? I mean, a lot of people thought that the 1960s, the quality of life in the US was just great. And yet we've doubled our energy consumption, of course, doubled the levels of pollution, doubled the levels of CO2 going into the atmosphere. And somehow there's a lot of people now, because of the focus on the environment, are beginning to realize, you know, do we really have to go on doing this? But I don't think that we'll be able to prescribe for the rest of humanity unless we're the ones that walk our talk.
Exactly. We're the ones who've got to wake up, because we have that power. We're at the moment the ones who are fostering the dissolution of the world. We're the ones who can change. And I actually see humanity is actually at this point in its evolution has sort of reached its final exam, its make or break time. And we like to think we're intelligent, but we're behaving so insanely and so stupidly in many ways. And I think we have to really wake up and show we really can be an intelligent species. I think if we don't, we probably won't be here in 10, 15 years' time. I think that's the real challenge we're up against.
So it's human transformation or extinction?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any middle way. A lot of people I talk to think that we can muddle on like this, but particularly if you look at the accelerating rates of change we're going through, and that's not going to stop. We're either going to have some major catastrophes very soon, or if we can change, we can avoid them. But it's going to require an inner change, a basic shift in values, because this course we're on at the moment doesn't work. And that's clear.
Well, I remember Einstein saying something rather similar, that that it was sort of a race between education and human extinction.
Yeah.
And it is interesting, isn't it, this sense that we really are coming now up to that final exam, you know, that we've created this mess on a planetary level. And I liked very much your pointing out that all of these people are running around now saying, oh, we have to save the planet. We have to save the planet.
Right.
And the point you were making.
We can't save the planet will save itself perfectly well. If people really wanted to save the planet, the best thing they should arrange is for humanity to get off it, because the planet will mend itself. All we can do is destroy it less fast. But the planet, we can't save the planet. The planet will save itself if we actually just get our act together.
Yes, if we get out of the way a little bit, or at least begin to realize that we have to share the planet with other species. I mean, at the rate of extinction of other species, you know, that we haven't even made, many of us haven't even made that connection
But there
yet.
again, if we do go, there have been many species extinctions in the past. I mean, it was only because the dinosaurs went that there was the opportunity for mammals and human beings to arise. So maybe from a grander perspective, if we don't work out, if humanity becomes extinct, maybe out of our ashes some new, more intelligent, literally more intelligent species will arise, which will be able to live in harmony with the environment.
So like maybe the dolphins will come out of the sea onto land, and they've already got bigger brains than we have, and
Who knows? Who knows?
Well, I think we've really just begun to explore these kind of issues, and I want to thank you very much for being with us. Our guest has been Peter Russell from London, a management consultant and author of The White Hole in Time. And this has been Worth Quoting from Florida Community College in Jacksonville. I'm Hazel Henderson, and I hope you'll join us again. Thank you.